Let's talk about Mike Martin. Choose hard, team glory. Those messages sound great at a press conference, and they look great at a t-shirt. He just recently had one, and they're nice things that coaches preach all of the time, but they aren't really more than words usually. That's not the case with Marcus Freeman and his program. We saw his players and staff embody those words this season, and it's pretty evident with the overall talent on this roster. And there's an uptick in blue chip ratio as far as the recruits are concerned, and the buy-in is there. The buy-in was not as much there with Brian Kelly, but it is certainly there as far as a culture standpoint with Marcus Freeman. Now, a lot of the Mike Martin job is concerned with players opting out. The transfer portal, we only saw one player opt out during the season for Notre Dame. No players entered the transfer portal at the conclusion of the regular season prior to the playoffs. And that is very different than some of the other teams that we saw, such as Georgia and Penn State, who lost key starters as after the season concluded as well. Only 6 players from Notre Dame decided to hop into the transfer portal at the end of the year after the playoffs. And again, that would be different as when you compare them to maybe an Ohio State or a Georgia or a Penn State or any of the other teams that made a deep run into the college football playoff. The projected starters, none of them opted out. Okay, that is huge. That shows a level of buy-in that is not at every single program. So Mike Martin is tasked with hopefully continuing on that, to help continue that on. It's not something that is very easy to do, and you're going to have to make these young players feel wanted. It's not easy to retain players in the college football era, the transfer portal era, and certainly even if you're able to tell them that they can start, they're not always going to 100% have that buy-in, and they might end up throwing their hat in the transfer portal. It's not easy to say how you can keep young people as, a part of your program. But one story I did want to mention is the Xavier Watts story. As we all know, he won the Nagurski and was just an amazing player for this defense last year. But in his first year, he redshirted, moved to wide receiver. Second year, moved to defensive back and played very little. In his third year, he finally was able to get the start, and he was okay. He wasn't the player that we saw in his fourth and final year here at Notre Dame. How are you going to get those players to buy in? On one hand, you have another young freshman cornerback who's a difference maker, Leonard Moore, on the defense and the secondary. Both of those stories are very valid. They are extremely pertinent to this type of program. At one end, you're going to have a player who is good from the jump, like Leonard Moore. On the other, you're going to have a guy like Xavier Watts, who doesn't really come on until later in his career. If you're Mike Martin, how do you get that player who's not Leonard Moore to stick around in the program to become a guy like Xavier Watts? Also, how do you get a guy like Leonard Moore to stick around in the program when he could potentially go anywhere else? It's the culture that you've established. You don't want to go anywhere else. So with those buzzwords at that press conference, this is kind of laying the foundation to continuing on a culture that Marcus Freeman has built. Now, Watts was kind of a different case. He's a different type of person, and maybe if it was somebody else who had a different outlook on things, they would leave. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to Mike Martin to keep those guys in-house. Part of his job is to find talent, but it's not going to be at the expense of finding the right people that fit Notre Dame and Freeman's program. He had a couple quotes that I wanted to share from this press conference that he had earlier on in the week, where he was just kind of talking about how they were going to continue to build. He says, I think process is a big part of what I believe in. I think to everything, there's a process, and developing out those processes and being well thought out with those processes are a big thing, even in evaluations. There's a lot more than seeing a talented kid play football. There's a lot more that goes into it, digging and figuring out the background of kids. I'm a big believer in the intangibles. So character will be a big part. I know here there are so many people of character. If you don't have that, and if you're not of a certain yoke, you'll be a little out of place here. I want to share, or I want to make sure you guys understand the process for me starts with character. I think that's huge, and I think that completely aligns with what Marcus Freeman wants to do. there are very few recruits that are ready to make an impact right away, especially since we saw all of those guys staying over from the COVID era. And a lot of players will be paid more than they potentially would make in the NFL. So they're going to stay even longer. It's all about being able to keep those guys in house and only have 6 guys enter the transfer portal at the end of the playoffs. None enter the transfer portal after the regular season, and only 1 opt out during the season. That is already an amazing sign for this program. Now, Martin worked for the Detroit Lions before his opportunity at Notre Dame. A big part of what drew him to this job was the similarities between the two organizations. Obviously, now we're seeing the transition from a lot of college football programs into looking like professional teams. The culture starts at the top and it trickles down from there. He had another quote about Jack Kaiser. Jack Kaiser probably said it, Jack Kaiser had a quote. Jack Kaiser said, it's the people, and Detroit, there's a lot of, after the national championship game, he was saying it was the people and it was the culture that kind of was able to give this team the momentum to get into the playoffs. Mike Martin also had a quote that kind of built off of that. Detroit, there's a lot of awesome people there. Dan Campbell is one of the most sincere people and a great person. Brad Holmes is the same. I felt a lot of the similarities here from the moment I met Coach Freeman and all of the staff. My staff currently is just a great feel. That's what makes this place special and what drew me to this place. There's always something to be learned from teams that win. One of the most important things to take away from Notre Dame's success last season is that character matters. And Mike Martin is going to continuously try to learn Notre Dame's culture and keep, building off of how you can not only find the best players, but also keep them in-house and make this Notre Dame football program one with extremely high culture, as it already has. Now, am I too worried about what is going to happen and what is going on with some of these freshmen or anybody that goes in the transfer portal? That's kind of up to you guys to assess. I don't really think this team has too much of an issue with losing guys in the transfer portal, but I definitely think that is something that could come in years down the line whenever we do get more 4 or 5 stars, and you can potentially see some of those guys hopping in the transfer portal instead of sticking around. Not everybody, like I said, is like Xavier Watts. And Mike Martin is just at a certain point going to, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some, but it's all about making sure that you can kind of pick out the players that you think might be able to stay a little longer, as long as you also value them and you want to continue to try to coach them through all 4 years. You don't leave, and dip out on them. A lot of these guys were still from the Brian Kelly era, the older guys. We're kind of seeing them leave now as time goes on, but if you can keep those guys in-house, from the Brian Kelly era, through the start of the Freeman era, then you should be able to keep the recruits that came here just for Marcus Freeman. So I really like Mike Martin. I love the hire. I made a video on that a couple weeks ago when it happened, about a month ago, actually, I should say. And I'm completely in on the Mike Martin hire at Notre Dame.